In this chapter, we will begin to look at developmental phases, and more specifically, we'll be taking a look at prenatal development and birth. So there are three main periods of prenatal development. There's what's called the germinal period. That's usually the first 2 weeks after conception. Usually, there's rapid cell division, beginning of cell differentiation, etc. There's also the embryonic period. That's the 3rd through the 8th week, and that's when the basic forms of all the body structures begin to develop. And finally, there is the fetal period. That's the 9th week until birth, and that's when the fetus grows in size and matures in functioning. So we'll take a little bit more in-depth here, exploration here of the germinal period. That's the first 14 days. And so that's when the zygote begins duplication and division within hours of conception. So it begins basically immediately, fundamentally immediately. That's when there's development of the placenta. There's what's known as implantation. That's usually about 10 days after conception. That's when the baby actually begins to attach to to the parts of the mother, and then that's when the organism begins to grow rapidly. Then we'll take a look at the embryonic period. Remember, that's from the 3rd week through the 8th week, and that's when the embryo, that's basically their neural tube begins to form, and that is the neural tube that actually becomes the brain and the spinal cord. And that's what's known as the brain and the spinal cord are known as the central nervous system. Here they just have the CNS to make that shorter, but that's what that refers to. And a couple other things that happen in that phase of development. The head begins to take shape, the eyes, ears, nose, and mouth form, heart begins to pulsate, and the extremities develop. So that's basically the fingers and toes, they actually separate. And so the development really is beginning to happen pretty rapidly from the 3rd week through the 8th week. Now this just kind of shows you some example photos here from that embryonic period here. We'll take a look at the fetal period. Now remember, the fetal period, that's the 9th week after conception until birth. So basically, during that period, that's when the genitals form, the sex chromosomes cause differences in brain organization. And then there was called cephalocaudal and proximodistal growth. And basically, that just means cephalocaudal just refers to growing from the head down. So, and then proximodistal growth, that refers to, the limbs of the individual. And the heartbeat becomes detectable. The cortex is not fully mature at birth, so the brain, the cortex is not fully mature, although they do mention that the brain at birth is the biggest part of the body. And that refers to that term, cephalocaudal. That means from the top down, from the brain down. So here's just, an image here. Here's an actual photo here of a fetus. And you can see how well developed it is. The face, the eyes, the nose, everything. Is pretty rapid growth through that. So we'll move on. So the middle 3 months of the fetus, that's when the digestive and excretory systems develop. That's when the individual starts to develop fingernails, toenails, buds for teeth, hair grows, including eyelashes. And then the middle 3 months here, part 2, we're going to take a look at the brain growth. And so the brain is experiencing very, very rapid growth. So it follows the sequence from the brainstem to the midbrain to the cortex. That's called the proximodistal, from the outward, working its way in. So during that phase, the baby develops many new neurons. That's called neurogenesis. That's the formation of new neurons and synapses. So that's also called synaptogenesis. You do not have to memorize that, but I would recommend definitely memorizing the term neurogenesis. That is what's important, the formation of new neurons. And this just shows the the prenatal growth of the brain. I just included this chart here just for you to examine on your own for further insight. Now, during the last 3 months of the fetal phase, involves expansion and contraction of lungs, final maturation of the heart valves, the arteries and veins, and extensive growth and folding of the cortex. So at birth, what happens is the fetal brain actually sends signals that release hormones in the mother to trigger the female's uterine muscles. So it's actually the baby's brain that triggers, and it basically tells the mother, I am ready to be born now, and let's start the process. And so that actually triggers the female's uterine muscles. So that's usually when labor begins. Okay. And so we're going to move on and start talking about, well, what kind of things, can be harmful to development or growth during these phases we've talked about. And so there's harmful substances. And what's important here is this term right here called teratogens. And teratogens are basically any agent or condition, including viruses and drugs, that result in birth defects or complications. So basically just harmful substances, that can result in birth defects or complications in human development. Now, another important thing too, is to know that there are what's known as behavioral teratogens. And those are the same thing, agents and conditions that can harm the prenatal brain, impairing the future child's intellectual and emotional functioning. So that is important to know on this slide right here. Okay, so how much stress, risk analysis, how much is too much, of teratogens, that kind of thing. How much is too much that can actually cause these effects in a baby that's in prenatal phase? So they use right here. I'm going to skip the threshold effect. We just want to know basically, the threshold, how much is too much. And, for example, heavy drinking, heavy smoking, those kinds of things can affect prenatal development. So, and then there's innate vulnerabilities. And if you remember from the previous chapter, genetic type information, can definitely affect, if they basically exercise themselves or whatever, those can create vulnerable situations for the growing baby. So right here, just really quickly, male fetuses, they're more vulnerable to teratogens than female ones. Don't know why that is, but it's just was discovered in research. And then another thing, is mother's genes, they can affect the prenatal environment she provides. So remember, genetic, information that's passed from parents to their children, those can definitely affect growth and development. And last but not least, there's neural tube defects. Remember, neural tube, that becomes the brain and spinal cord, has been determined that are a little more common in certain ethnic groups, and they list a few of them here. I don't expect you to memorize that. I just wanted to make you aware of that. Okay, so we're going to take a look at low birth weight and the mother. So first of all, there's maternal behavior, mother's behavior. And the mother's, health, illness, drug use before and during pregnancy, those, all can affect the baby's birth weight. And another thing too is the maternal malnutrition, or the mother not being adequately receiving nutrition. So that can definitely affect the birth weight of the baby as well. And for those of you who are wondering, well, what about the father? So that's more of an indirect influence of risk for adverse birth outcomes. So some things that can affect the health and wellness of the mother and the baby that she is carrying. It can be the father's attitude, the father's behavior, and the relationship between the mother and father. How much stress is involved, how much support. All those affect the health of the baby. Okay, now we're going to take a look at the new family, the newborn, So basically, newborns, they seek to protect themselves with 3 sets of reflexes. So first of all, they strive to maintain oxygen through breathing, hiccuping, sneezing, etc. Then the second reflex is constant body temperature. So things like crying, shivering, tucking legs to the body, pushing, all those are a result of striving to maintain a regular, constant body temperature. Now, finally, the last reflex was feeding, and that can be sucking, rooting, swallowing. So those 3 reflexes right there for newborns are extremely important for the baby, as important functions for the baby to protect themselves. And, in new families, mothers, about half of all women may experience, physical problems after birth. So that can also be, things like postpartum depression, that's biologically based here. And it can result in, psychological type processes, but it can be biologically based. And they talk about some of the symptoms, of postpartum depression, like sadness, inadequacy, et cetera, may not be able to actually adequately care for the baby. And so there's, varied causes for that. There isn't one hard, fast rule for that. It just, a lot of it can depend on, the bio, psycho, and social type factors. Okay, now we're going to take a look at the fathers. So not only fathers, but the entire social network and culture are crucial influences on the health of the new family. So in the father's role, helping the mother stay healthy, helping mother manage stress, that affects the fetus. Providing legal acceptance, of the birth, that's another important thing too. So those are just a few factors that are important factors that the father contributes to the overall health of a new family. Also here's just a term that's, fairly important called Parental Alliance. And that just means basically, commitment by both parents to cooperate in raising the child. And we'll take a look here, parent-infant bonding. And so remember, bonding, that includes strong connection. Bonding means a strong, loving connection. And, it basically forms when parents hold, examine, feed the newborn. And, it's interesting they mention, but early skin-to-skin contact is not essential for human bonding. Can be the other factors as well, like feeding, examining, looking at, interacting, talking, making sounds. All those are important for human bonding. So that ends our discussion here. So please immediately get your study guide for this chapter and begin to answer its questions. And we will see you at the next chapter.